We're here today with Lauren Ruiz, a research-based multimedia artist from Long Island, New York. Her work has featured in solo and group museum exhibitions, countless other gallery and group exhibitions across the country and across the world. You've shown internationally, and you're currently represented by marquee projects in Bellport, New York, right here on the island. Welcome to Inner Rhythm, Lauren. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have worked together before. We did a show together in 2023 at the Museum of the Southwest in Midland, Texas, Sheol. And this exhibition, I feel like, is sort of indicative of, or encapsulates, some of the consistent themes in your practice. One of those is this theme of sacred space. Today we're here at the Pollock-Krasner house, of course, in Springs. For many, considered a sacred space. The studio in particular, it's like this pilgrimage site, right? Both because of Pollock and Krasner's production in there. Some people are drawn more to the history of one than the other. But the marks on the walls, on the floor, people come from far and wide to be in this space. What is your relationship with the sacred? How were you drawn to the idea of these sacred spaces? What are the sacred spaces in your life?
That's a good question. Well, I was raised Roman Catholic, so as far as sacred space, my relationship now, and I guess and always has been, very much sensorial. So it's about not only a space, but what you see in the space, what you smell in the space, the light in the space, what you hear in the space, and how your body moves through a space. So I think that's something that has stuck with me in my work and how I think about sacred spaces. There's always a sense of quiet or a sense of tuning inward in a sacred space, where the form that the body is in, or my body, if we're talking about me directly, it forces an internal confrontation. So the sacred exterior space makes you really reflect internally. And so in a lot of my work, or specifically the work that I did at the Museum of the Southwest, I wanted to see how I could use all of these aspects of these aesthetic aspects to force a viewer inside themselves. Because I think that's where the most interesting things happen. If you can connect with someone's internally, like in their mind, in their just how they relate to themselves. So that's what I try to do with my work, essentially.
And in life, in the world, we have these organically created sacred spaces, like the Pollock-Krasner studio, which is considered important because of the things that happened there and the lifespan that those things had after they were created. You, on the other hand, are fashioning sacred spaces, fictional spaces that maybe are responding to things in the real world, in life, but the sacred space itself is of your own invention. How do you go about fabricating the sacred?
That's a really good question. I feel like I use indicators of sacred spaces, whether that be materially, like, for instance, in the show that you're referring to, I had sacred oil chrisms made that would kind of direct someone's mind to the sacred. So I guess using the visual language of sacred space, or essentially visual language or sound. It's not always easy because I have to draw on my own experience, but then try to understand what sacredness means to others at the same time.
Which is very relevant to the show in Texas, because you are from Long Island, you're from the Northeast. Your show in Texas, where you did a residency, ended up incorporating elements that are very specific to that region. It was a large-scale installation. It was immersive. People entered into a subterranean environment. You know, your sculptures The space that you created echoed a cavern environment like the Carlsbad Caverns, but also this idea of the subterranean in terms of oil production, which is native to West Texas where the show was, and also this historical story of the Midland woman, these remains of a Pleistocene era woman. We're also commenting on fertility, oil, the fertility of the earth, the fertility of the female body, universal themes then connected to the specifics of the environment. You have shown your work recently in the Pacific Northwest. Like I said, you're based here in Long Island. How important is it for you to empathize with the place you are showing versus expressing something specific to yourself as a person? How do you balance the specific and the universal?
Yeah. Well, I think for me with my work, I'm not interested in, I don't really care about, controversially, I don't really care about art that much. I use art as a tool to communicate ideas about bigger things. This is my tool. This is my toolkit of how I can have conversations with others. So for me, going to Texas, I didn't want to come in and have any type of immediate judgment or criticism of the space, of the people, of the communities. That's just not my style. I wanted to use my work as a forum to have a conversation. So it was important for me to get a sense of why communities relate to their space, specifically their land, and more specifically underground, the way that they do. Because it would be so easy for me as, again, someone from Long Island who is to just go in and be like, oh, oil's bad, right? But like, what is that? What is it? How do we relate to that space to lead us all to a place of how we treat something in this way or another way? It's tricky. There's a fine line of like how I want to think about something, how I view something versus how I need to approach something from another way so that someone who thinks about something differently can feel comfortable enough to have a conversation with me and not feel like they are being chastised, because that does nothing for anyone.
Yeah.
So it was important for me to create kind of a sense of trust and to be empathetic to the local community, because this is their livelihood, this is their life, this is what they know. Who am I, right? So there was so much more to investigate there, and I feel like there still is, than just, oh, Midland is oil country. Like that could just put like a period on it instead of a question mark, or like an ellipses where there's more to mine and talk about.
And what I personally find unique about the experience of your work is that when you are dealing something with, broadly speaking, like with the sacred, you are not flat out worshiping, of course, or aping a sacred space, but you're also not mocking the idea of sacredness. You're not treating it ironically or just critically. For you, would you say that, does the sacred exist?
Totally. I think that life would be terrible if there wasn't something sacred, whatever that may be for someone. There's something about something external to the physical. Like there's something more than just the tactile experience of the world. And I think as artists, I feel like most artists would say, actually, I don't know, but for me, the sacredness is important even in my making. Like it's important for me to comment on these things or use the aesthetics of the sacred, but also in my process of making, that flow state is me experiencing the sacred. So it's not just about organized religion or like sacred sites like the Pollock-Krasner house. It's about this internal sacredness that can be reached through external stimuli. And I think that's really interesting.
And it is very interesting that you point out that the sacred is not always just spatial but it can be inherent in process. That makes me think, again, we're talking about a studio space here. This sacred process that you're undertaking takes place in a space. What is your relationship to the studio? Do you have a specific studio? Is the studio a sacred space for you, or is it just any space where sacred work takes place?
Yeah. That's a really good question, because for a while I would have said, oh, my studio is this sacred space where that's where I think and I work and things happen. But when you're put in a situation where you don't have a studio, where, like, listen, growing up I was always an artist, and I was always just making work wherever I could, usually painting giant oil paintings in my bedroom with no ventilation, which I don't advise. But it wasn't about, oh, I have a space first and then I'm going to do something in it. Like, studio is anywhere. It's a state of mind. Like, everything is process. So for me, I'm not a traditional artist who's like, I'm going to go to the studio for 8 hours today and like do this thing. Sometimes I wish I was, because I feel like that there's something very romantic about that, and it creates a sense of discipline in going into a space that asks you to be of a certain mindset. But for me, a lot of my process is conversation, and a lot of my process is just thinking through things and talking through things and note-taking and watching documentaries and ruminating again and ruminating some more. And then I'm like, oh, okay, now I'm ready. And then I set up a situation, whether it's in my backyard or in the kitchen, or right now I do have a studio space, but the space is not contingent, or the work is not contingent on the space that I have to make the work. The work just is made wherever I can figure out how and when and where to make it.
The space is functional. It is there to facilitate the manifestation of something that was conjured in what it sounds like for you is the true sacred space, which is your own inner self.
Yeah. And I think that's important for a lot of young artists, especially now where space is so limited. Like, physical space, like land, just all of it is so limited. Especially thinking economically. Like, there's ways in which artists can feel like, oh, I can't actually do the thing because I don't have the space for it. Well, no, maybe you have to adapt your work. Maybe you have to adapt your approach to making, and it needs to evolve to meet you where you are. You don't have to abandon ship because you don't have, a 12 by 12 white box to paint in. Like, who cares? Do something small, do something outside. And I think that gives me, and would give others, I think, the freedom to continue being an artist and like living creatively, because you're not limiting yourself to these traditional constraints of what it means to make work. And in that, it feels very freeing. And that's something I've realized recently, where it doesn't, like, in the last few years, I've just been creative with where I make. And sometimes you get an eyebrow raise, or like, oh my gosh, what are you doing out? And you just have to, you stay true to your work and you do the thing, and that's it.
Has your work changed as a result of that change in state of mind?
Yeah, well, because also it's a state of place. Like, it had to change because I didn't have the space. So I went from a place where, like, for instance, I went to Stony Brook for my MFA, and while I was there, I had a big studio space. So I was making bigger work. I was making a lot of work. I had the space to do it. And then when I graduated, that space was gone. And it was a challenge for a while to be like, oh my gosh, I'm used to making these giant installations. What am I going to do now? Well, I turned towards digital, and I started making digital works. And I would sit at the kitchen table on my laptop and just make a different type of work that was still conceptually and foundationally similar to the work I was doing in my studio space. Or I was doing work in the basement with earthworms. Like, everything, you just have to shift to where you are, or I had to shift where I was to accommodate the need to make.
And if I recall, for your show in Texas, you did some very large-scale sculptural spray foam silicone works that you made in your driveway.
Yeah.
That's a space too.
Just in the driveway.
Yeah.
And you'd have people walking their dog, looking at you like, what's going on? And you're just like, okay, I'm just making my work. Like, what are you supposed to do, right? Like, this is the space that I had. So I had to adjust to working in a studio space, like inside, controlled atmosphere, to being outside in the cold, in the rain, making work. And it's just what you do. If it's your work and you treat it as such, then you have to have the discipline to accommodate the production of that thing.
From what you were saying earlier, going into a foreign land like West Texas, being open and able to be flexible and respond to what you are seeing rather than go in with a preconceived notion, taking that thread to your conception of studio, as you're also being flexible. The studio is from within and it can manifest wherever it can manifest. There is this sense of you being very fluid in the world. I want to ask you then about where you are from. So you are born and raised on Long Island, East Islip. Your gallery is on Long Island, Bellport. You went to university here, and you're still based here. So, and a number of your pieces have dealt with the land of Long Island as subject. Does Long Island feel like your native land as compared to other places you have visited and responded to through your work?
Definitely. Yeah. To the point where I feel like I don't have the same type of objective relationship to where I'm living as I could have, obviously, to a place that I'm not familiar with. I'm seeing things differently when I go elsewhere than I would, or I'm not as observant here as I would be in a different place. So, and yeah, I mean, living here my whole life, going to undergrad at Hofstra, going to grad school at Stony Brook, like working at Stony Brook now. This is, yeah, I would say, sure, it's my land, but I don't know about native land, because then we can go into this whole thing about like, what does it mean to be of a place, or like being generations removed from people who have come into a land. So I think that term might be a little bit questionable, but it's definitely my home and where I feel the most, like I'm just the most familiar with. Yeah, but I also don't feel like I see it in the way that maybe I should sometimes, in like a positive way. Yeah.
You do have a photo series that you're in the middle of right now. An example of this series is currently on view at the Long Island Biennial at the Heckscher Museum.
Yes.
And this series deals explicitly with the idea of nativeness and of one's relationship to land. Can you tell me a little bit about that series, how it came about, and how it reflects on you as a person?
Well, this series, I feel like this is the first time I'm really thinking more about my lived experience and the lived experience of those who came before me, as in parents, grandparents, and how my relationship to ownership of land or belonging to a land, or how we treat land as resource, like how that's all playing out for me. It's wrapped up in ideas of identity and how certain people can exist in two spaces or aren't seen by either space, particularly those who are of, in my experience, both white and Hispanic descent, where you can kind of be seen as one or the other based on the context that you are in. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and like, how do I relate to myself, my history, my identity, and essentially like the traumas and shame that have essentially been passed down over the generations to force me to feel a certain way about myself and how I inhabit a space. So for this series, I'm thinking about this erasure, this slow but steady erasure of culture, and this kind of run towards whiteness as immigrant families come into the States, particularly with me from Puerto Rico to Brooklyn, and then how it's kind of pushed towards, oh, well, you're American now, and what does being American mean? It's always this race, it's running towards whiteness in my experience. So these works, I'm in whiteface, and I go to national parks and set up shop with a rug or a lamp, a plant, things that would indicate that I am trying to claim or domesticate or carve out a spot for myself in this space. I'm still trying to figure out why national parks. There's like something about the park system that's really interesting to me that I haven't really fleshed out yet. This is the first time where I feel like I haven't fully fleshed out a work before I started doing it. Usually I'm like, oh, I have an idea, this is what it is, now I produce it, and then that's the end. This is the first time where I'm figuring it out as I am doing it. And I guess also with the series, I'm thinking about, like you said, native, what it means to be an invader or invasive of a land, and what it means to be visible or invisible in a space. So these are things that are kind of stewing in the project, and how I relate to land and myself through that. Yeah.
Have you found the process of not knowing where it's going before hopping in beneficial?
It's frightening. It's awful, but good. I mean, there's more room for things to happen and evolve, but it's also harder to talk about.
Yeah.
That's the thing, where if I'm like, oh, this is what I'm exploring, and this is what I'm reading, and this is what I'm doing, it's easier to explain to someone else, and it's easier for me to follow through from point A to point B without something changing in the middle. It's like, this is the plan, this is what I'm doing. But when you're just doing and following these little seeds, you don't know where the next thing is going to go, but you just have to trust the process, if you will, which is not something that I'm not familiar with, super comfortable. I'm not super comfortable with trusting the process, but it feels good to do.
There also seems to be something real about discussing something in process before you've had the chance to look back on it in retrospect and put a bow on it.
Totally. Yeah. And it puts me in like a very vulnerable place, it feels, where there's room for, it allows external things to change and shape the thing as it's being made, versus, oh, it's done, here, look, and whatever you say doesn't matter because I've finished it. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know. It's scary, but it's also good because it allows for things to breathe and grow and move and develop in a more authentic way, where it's not out of fear. Yeah. I feel like I've produced out of fear sometimes in the past, or like been very careful about figuring everything out before I do it, instead of just like doing it and seeing how it goes. And that's where I'm at right now, and it feels good.
In the era of social media, I've heard some artists talk about the extent to which other artists show their process and show every step of the process as a negative. Mm-hmm. But now I'm thinking about how you have said that conversation is so important to your practice and is really the heart of it, and that work is just a jumping off point for conversations. Mm-hmm. That being the case, would not showing the process or emphasizing the process or making the midpoint the place to talk to others about the work, would that not be more at the core of the work than handing the finished piece off? Of course, you could talk about a finished piece, though, too. Yeah, and then
but I think it's also important to have. It depends on the type of work we're talking about. if it's a more traditional work where, like, let's say I'm making a sculpture, right? Like, I'm going to have conversations about it while it's in process with select individuals that I want to have these conversations with. But if you want that finished thing, the finished thing is where the conversation can start sometimes. Yeah. So it really depends on what type of work it is and what context you're in, of who you're speaking to, and what you want to get out of that conversation. So it's really, again, it's like there's no right answer there. It's like very much about context and like what the work is and what you're expecting from the work, or how you want to engage with the person you're talking to.
In the Invaders series, the photography series that we were just speaking about, you are the subject. Literally, you are in front of the camera. As you put space between you and your MFA, do you find that your work becomes more personal in general, or is this just this specific case?
I think it's just this specific case, because a lot of my other work isn't, well, okay, that's a tricky question, because I could argue that everyone's work is personal. They can just be more upfront about it, or they can be more elusive. And so I think I've been I used to be very elusive about it, to the point where I would try and distance myself entirely from my work, where I wouldn't even be like, oh, this is a show by Lauren Ruiz. I would just have like the title, and it's like this other thing, and I'm nowhere to be found, and I try and separate myself from my work. But now, yeah, it's becoming more intertwined with my experience of the world. This series specifically is very much about my experience, but also is about a lot of other people's experience. So in that way, it's very personal, but it is relatable, and it is talking about this broader thing. And I'm using my experience as that kind of, that thing to have that conversation around. Usually I separate it a little bit, and it's like, oh, it's about this work, it's about this like fictive space, it's about this narrative, and that is what the conversation can be about. This one's just like a little closer to home, and also like I'm in the photographs, which I'm usually not. This is my first photo series. I've done digital video before, and I've taken photographs, but it's never been a part of my practice. So this is the first time photography has been a part of my practice, which is scary enough, because anyone can take a photograph, but to take a good photograph, I think it's the hardest thing to do. So there's that, where it's like, oh my gosh, I don't know this thing. I'm entering this conversation with this medium that I don't know anything really about, like not enough about. And then to put myself in front of the camera is also uncomfortable. And then to do it in a way where I don't know, like the white face has been a weird thing for me, but it's also about like presenting as white, where like I do. So it's like, how do you, or like, I guess that's also depends on the context too. Do I present as white or not? But it's questioning that, where I'm trying to spark a conversation that's even uncomfortable for me, but needs to be had, because this is where our world is right now, culturally, and I just want to have a conversation about it. And I think that's the place to use your own experience, to be like, this is happening, this is where we're at, I have to talk about my experience.
It can be an uncomfortable conversation, and if you could imagine a listener or a viewer of this conversation right now not familiar with your work or the context in which you're speaking, what do you think their reaction, us not having fully explained every aspect of the series, what do you think their reaction might be to you saying, I'm in whiteface in the pictures?
I don't know. I feel like you'd have to see the work. I don't know. I don't know if that's my business to think that far ahead into what someone would think me describing my work would mean to them.
Do you anticipate the viewer while you're making work, or you try not to think about that?
I feel like I used to think about the viewer a lot more, but it was always in a way of trying to circumvent critical or criticism, actually, where I would try and get around every corner to be like, well, if someone says this, then I can rebuttal with this. And now I only think about it as far as, can someone connect with this? Not, oh, is someone gonna have a problem with this? Because people are gonna have a problem with everything or anything. And my work isn't for everybody, and those who get it will get it, and those who don't, it's fine. There's other things for them to get.
And then even in terms of, we're talking about uncomfortable situations or taking yourself out of your comfort zone, there's a medium that you are not as familiar with as you are with other mediums, photography. You're putting yourself in front of the camera. And then you also have this built-in apparatus into the concept where you are taking yourself out of home. I have to do this in these parks that are far and wide across the country. It makes me get on the road, get in a plane. It makes me go away.
Yeah.
Are you pulled more and more to getting away from home?
Definitely. Yeah, I think so. Doing residencies also helps with that. And I don't go to residencies to be like, oh, I have a studio space, I can go make work. It's about exploring somewhere else, and through that exploration of another place, I'm coming more to terms with myself. And I think that is where the work is developing, because then I get a better sense of what I want and how I'm moving through the world and what I want to say in my work. And what's funny is you always get these good things out of me, Matt. I don't know if I would have thought about that like that. But yeah, I think the more that I develop my work, I'm like, okay, I need to go be out in these other places, because I think that's where this discomfort that happens internally and externally, where I'm like flailing around, that's where good things happen. I mean, to bring it back to when I was artist in residence at the Museum of the Southwest, I came there, we had a conversation about me being artist in residence for a year. I would come down a few times over that year, explore, visit some archives, develop a site-specific installation, whatever that may be, which was great because you gave me the freedom to be like, I just want just some type of installation, and you just kind of gave me that free reign. But when I got there, I was so unsure about how I was expected to approach the idea of research. Because research can mean a lot of things for a lot of different people. And you being, at that time you were still in your PhD, you were an art historian, you're the curator of this museum. My understanding of what you thought research was a lot different than what my research was going to be in that space. So I was so anxious because I was like, oh my God, maybe I should be like in the library more. I should be reading, I should be going to these museums and whatnot. And I wound up just going for a drive to, Monahan's State Park, the Sand Hills. And I laid in the dirt. I laid in the sand for like hours because I was so just like, I don't know how to relate to this expected idea of research. But in that, I was doing my research because I was on the ground. I was relating my body to the space and allowing myself to like be buried by the sand slowly. And that planted the seed. So this way, when you brought up that you're like, oh, didn't I tell you that the Midland Discovery was at Monahan's State Park? I was like, oh my gosh, no way, that's where I just was. And that connected these two things, where if I hadn't just trusted myself to be like, I'm just going to go out and just sit in the sun, that might not have developed. So yeah, I think this process of learning to trust what works for me, which is different than what works for a lot of my own artist friends, and then I feel like, oh, I don't know if I'm doing this right. This is just what I am doing. And like that feels really good to just trust in the fact that I have to be always uncomfortable.
Yeah. Expectation, whether it's coming from the world or from ourselves, can be, I think, such an obstacle to creativity and to true expression. And in that situation, yeah, I think there is this idea of a residency. I need to perform as an artist in residence. What is that? What does that performance look like?
Yeah.
Is it this many hours of study in the library, or is it this report or this or that? If you're working on a project about a specific land, if your body has not had that experience of being in and with the land, can you attack it from a purely abstract point of view of researching the book? I wouldn't think so.
Yeah.
So yeah, that experiential, I am going to lay in the sand, that has to be research. That has to, and I mean, this is just labels, this is language, these are words.
Yeah.
But if you haven't had that experience, how can you understand if you don't have the baseline understanding of what does this land look like, feel like, sound like, smell like?
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just commenting on somebody else's impression of that land.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you're referencing maybe primary resources from, and then why would I have had to come down there at all?
Right.
To go and just, yeah, it's just a totally different approach to knowledge making. And I needed to lean into my embodied experience of a place and just be out driving around for hours, listening to like some outlaw country music and like whatever was on the radio, and like going to, oh, what was that place that I loved so much? Higher Grounds, the evangelical coffee shop. They had a really good matcha there. Like, just like, and then even there, it was like, oh wow, like this, it's a totally, like it's a theocratic society down here. Like I wouldn't have gotten that. I wouldn't have felt what that felt like to be like, okay, well, if you want an avocado toast and a matcha latte, you have to go to an evangelical coffee shop, because the rest of the places here are like fried chicken, and it just, the way you get access to even food, like food that would be seen as culturally coming from a different place, was linked to money and religion, and like who is in power in that area, right? Like oil and religion, and that can facilitate more of like a global feel instead of like a local feel. It was just fascinating to me. Like, I don't even know if that made sense, but
no, it does.
It was so exciting to also think about being in that place or other places I've gone as like an anthropological study, where it's not just, oh, I'm making art. It's like I'm seeing what life is like here, because I know one way of being and living, and Long Island is like a very big place, a very, very small place. And like, how do I relate to this place versus other? It's a whole thing.
But I think also it is important, I think, to investigate a word that you use there. There are undoubtedly elements of it being an anthropological study, because no matter how immersed you become, you're a visitor. So you are observing. But you're not simply observing.
Yeah.
I think from what you said and from seeing it firsthand, you were living. You were there, you were living there, you were embracing, not judging. So not purely anthropological. I think you'd be doing yourself a disservice by just calling it that. But certainly there's aspects of it. But what's really interesting is that we've spoken about home. For you, Long Island, when you're at home, it can sometimes be difficult to have the distance, not only to understand the place, but to understand yourself within the place. So when you go somewhere else and you are the outsider, the irony becomes that being the outsider or being in this different place, whether it's because you feel more freedom or because there's things to compare yourself to, you could end up understanding yourself more and feeling more like yourself and actually being more yourself elsewhere. Of course, this isn't true for everybody. When you're an outsider in some places, it can really stifle the self. But for you, you have gone elsewhere and learned about yourself. I want to take that back now to Long Island.
Okay.
How has Long Island shaped you for better or for worse as an artist?
Oh my gosh. Well, to comment on what you said previously first.
Go ahead.
It also depends on how you show up in the world.
Okay.
Right? Like if I'm going to, me in my body I'm going to be received differently in Texas than someone else in another body.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I was very aware of how I was being perceived in all of these spaces. And I think that's something to also consider, because then that really, it can act as a mirror of like something I wouldn't have noticed here on Long Island.
Yeah.
I'm noticing now when I'm going to this other place. Like I'm seeing other people are showing me how they're seeing me.
And you and your body, you're the control group. And when you take yourself from
Yeah.
one place to another,
Yeah.
you still have to mention that there is specificity to you, your body, your personality, your beliefs, and the way that the people, the place reacts to you, the same or
Yeah.
differently. That's where you get
Yeah.
discovery.
And then it can be like, oh, I didn't know that you saw me that way, or how I am seen. And that can also come back to this idea of like invasion, invader, who belongs, who doesn't. Like how am I being identified in a space? But as far as Long Island shaping me as an artist, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that I had a lot of freedom to experiment with different types of work here, to meet a lot of artists here, a lot of people who grew up on Long Island and created art spaces here, which was really a wonderful thing. For example, like the Patchogue Arts Council, almost everyone, as far as I know, who works there and has built that up to be what it is from Long Island and are artists. So there's a lot of commitment in these. They are siloed because Long Island is a weird place where there are these like silos and like pockets of art places, which it would be nice if everyone kind of was more communicative. But there are people who love this place and want to create more of an art space along the broader stretch of Long Island and not just keeping it like this like East End arts thing. So that was really formative for me. And also growing up, my family, we always would drive out to Montauk for the summer and like spend a few days. So we would come through and do like Pollock-Krasner House and the Parish Art Museum. And so there was always like once a year at least where I was like, oh, we're going to see these things. And I was also kind of like mystified. It was mystifying, this like the romantic East End painter, like artist type, that I was like, oh, I want that. Like I want to be this studio artist, like in my late at night, like with my paintbrush and my cigarette and doing the whole thing, which obviously didn't turn out that way. But that like dream of what it could be to be this like coastal artist was planted very early. And although my own practice has taken shape in so many different other ways, like I still identify with that and carry that with me as part of why I pursue my work and why I make the work that I do, because it's such, I don't know, it feels like...
Do you identify with that?
With what?
With
Smoking
the
cigarettes?
myth of
No.
with sort of the myth of the Eastern Long Island artist. Did it feel like when you would visit these locations, being from Western Suffolk, growing up, when you would visit these locations, did it feel like you were going to an artistic representation of your home, or did it feel like you were going to a different state or a different place? Did it
No, it didn't feel like a different place.
Okay.
It just felt very aspirational.
Okay.
Where I was like,
aspirational.
oh, I want to be that type of artist. Because also, as a kid, I wasn't super exposed to all these different artists who live in different places, who work in different mediums. It was very much like East End painter. And I am not a painter. I started out as a painter, but I don't identify as a painter at all. Clarification. But yeah, there's still something really beautiful about this. I think it was the idea of being by the water in isolation with my work. And having the space to do it, which is interesting because I'm like, well, I'll make work wherever, because the space it's internal.
But sometimes the external can make it feel easier.
Yeah, of course. But when you don't have it, you got to do what you got to do. You have to be resourceful with like making space wherever you are. Yeah.
Thinking of Lauren as a little kid, She's an artist. She knows she wants to be an artist. You said you started in painting. You are now in a place where what you do is very unique to you. Could you give us a little bit of an idea of that journey? I know that's a long story, but how did you come to feel comfortable doing what you're doing? How did you move from like, this is traditionally what an artist is, it's a romantic painter, to I'm going to make these immersive other worlds, world building, sci-fi, set looking things? How do you get there?
Well, I think a lot of it was that I didn't know what I was doing. And I didn't, there were moments where I didn't think that what I was doing or what I was interested in was art, but I was just doing it anyway. But also a lot of it happened, to be fair, at Stony Brook, where I worked with really good faculty members who advised, like, no, do this, like, keep on this track because this is good. And I was very like, I don't know, it's just something I'm interested in. I'm just like writing these notes in this notebook and thinking about like plastic. So having the right people to steer, having that was really beneficial for me.
Conversation.
Seriously though, like all of my critiques, I didn't get anything out of someone saying, oh, you should make this blue different, or like this, the way you're doing this texture here, or this form. No, it was just about like, what are your ideas? What are you trying to, like, what are you thinking about? And then asking me the right questions so that I was like, and then I would just like, cry and freak out and have a meltdown, but that would help me figure out what I really was asking. And then I could approach the work in a different way. So I think it was really having really good advisors at a critical point in my life that really steered me in the direction that I'm at now. Because sure, I was always thinking about interiority of the body and I don't know, like speculative fiction and like sci-fi and all of this stuff growing up into my teen years and early 20s, but it was all a mess. And I was just still trying to fit that all into like a painting. You can't, and you don't have to. And so I think when I was able to just break out of that, I had the room, there was room then for these ideas to actually be what they had to be, instead of just trying to squeeze them into like, well, this is the traditional way to do things, because I didn't know other ways until I knew of other ways, but I didn't think I could do it that way. And so having the right people have the confidence in me gave me the confidence in myself to be like, oh, you know what? Yeah, I'm just going to keep doing this thing because this feels good. And this is what I want to say. And this is the medium, whatever weird medium that may be, that I want to do it in. So, yeah.
Lauren, why all the worms?
Matt, because they're freaking amazing. Oh my gosh. Okay, so do you want the full story?
Yeah.
So, why all the worms? Earthworms, I can't even. The pandemic was a weird time for a lot of people, right? I'm not excluded from that group. I had a little like worm farm in my basement, earthworms, because I was thinking about micro and nanoplastics in the soil, and I had read somewhere something about the fact that earthworms' body weight was decreasing by like 6% each year because they're ingesting microplastics and they think it's food, but they're not actually getting any nutrients out of it, obviously, whatever. And so I was like, oh, there's something to this worm thing. And again, I was like, I don't know this was another instance of me not knowing what I was doing, but just doing it anyway. So I got some worms off of Amazon, and I made a worm bin, and I got a contact mic and some headphones, and recorded, just buried the mic in the soil with the worms, and I just hung out with them for a while. And that experience was so bizarre because I started to really relate to them as other beings in a way that I hadn't before. Like, we're outside right now. Can you even like comprehend the amount of living beings that are underneath our feet right now in just like this like 10 by 10 foot square? Like, we couldn't even count them if you want to go down to like microbes and whatnot. But even just things we could see would be millions. Like, it's amazing to me. The things that we don't think about, the life forms that we don't think about, or the way they experience the world. Do you think about the way an earthworm experiences the world? I do. I want to know. So in that, like, that was my first, that was like the first series of questions that I had. And then I was thinking about their labor and like, oh, how let me back up. Did you know that earthworms are non-native?
No.
They are non-native. The ones that we have here, the night crawlers and the red wigglers, those are non-native to North America. They came over with European settlers.
Wow.
They are invasive. But this is where we go back to language, and this, like we were talking about the idea of native earlier. The idea of something being deemed invasive versus something being non-native it's a very thin line, but it's like, well, do they cause harm to X? Mm-hmm. It depends on who those life forms are, like what being is being affected as to whether or not they are considered like harmless, but they're, non-native, or they're causing harm to something, and then they are considered invasive. So because these earthworms came over with these European settlers and basically just infiltrated the land, wiping out the other earthworms that were here previously, creating, like, just re-engineering the soil so that it now can accept European crops. What is that?
Yeah.
So that's this whole other layer of thinking about what it means to be an invasive being, or an invisible being, or an invisible laborer in a space or of a land. And does that mean that they belong? What does that mean? So it started with just the earthworm itself, but then it became about their labor, their resource, why they are here, what they do, and how we relate to land, and like what is visible or what is invisible of a land. And it kind of blew open this whole thing that then led to this photo series 6 years later.
Invasive or non-native insects. I've been thinking about this lately. I was coming out of Atlantis Diner in West Islip the other day.
Love it.
And the walkway was strewn with the bodies of lanterns.
Lantern flies.
And this has really galvanized people to,
Totally.
no matter our differences, we've all come together and we're all going to kill
To
this
smash
bug.
the lantern flies.
How about that, Lauren?
So that's one of these things, right? Where the lantern fly is harmful because it, I don't even know why. Do you know why they're?
Now I'm going to step on it.
Exactly. You don't even know why, but for some reason someone told you, because they saw it on News 12, that we should kill all the lantern flies. And I'm not saying we should or should not. This is not, what do I know?
Yeah, we're uneducated.
And just deciding we're going to wipe out this, they're not allowed to be here because someone told me so. Hello. What is that?
Yeah.
It's amazing to me. It's just so interesting to me. So, but then does that make the lanternflies like a villain because they are harming another species? Do they know that they're harming them? How did they get here?
It's interesting because they're also, I think, quite beautiful. They have that bright red and those nice spotted wings.
Yeah.
And my only relationship with them so far is knowing to kill them and thinking that they're beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's interesting.
Yeah. Because then we could also decide like whether something's valuable or not based on their aesthetic.
Yeah.
If it was ugly, if something is ugly but not invasive, do we want to keep that? Or like, we'll just bring in like an exotic plant instead.
Yeah.
But like this bug who's like beautiful, do we keep it? Like that's a whole nother layer of like how we value beauty. If it's it's a whole thing.
And is the lanternfly the villain, or is it a Trojan horse for the villain, meaning whatever country it came from?
Yeah. It's all so complex and
maybe it does something really bad too.
it
Bill,
might.
Does the lanternfly
Yeah,
do?
Bill.
Bill, you know about the lanternfly. What does the lanternfly do?
I'm learning about it as we go. I don't know, but there is something to be said for is it destroying, like the nutria in
Yes.
Louisiana and Texas, going back to Texas. It's destroying the marshland.
Mhm.
It's eating it back into the sea.
Nutria is a type of rat.
Terrible rat.
Yeah.
Terrible rat.
Yeah. And they're also really ugly. So that might hurt their case.
Yeah.
They're very ugly. Here's another thing, which we can cut if too personal. But the ticks, are they native?
I don't know.
But very harmful. Bill cannot eat the cloven beast of the earth now because of the tick.
Yeah. Alpha gal.
So
He's got
changed
alpha-gal.
completely changed your microbiome.
But it helped me become the vegan that I always wanted to be.
Whoa! He's his true self now because of the tick.
But then he's saying, like, was the tick the villain, or was it just it helped you become your true self?
And in his Bill native. You
I
know?
have to come here to get alpha gal.
Yeah.
Gosh, all these
Lauren,
questions.
you are an artist. This is both your identity and your career. What is difficult about that, and what is nice about that?
What is difficult about that? Honestly, I feel like right now, the only thing that's difficult about it is making sure that I make enough money doing something else to support my work. And that might be seen as a big thing, but I think if that's the hardest thing you have to deal with, that's not so bad. Like, everything else feels really good. Like, I feel like I can just do, and I have the freedom to explore the things that I want to explore, and then sometimes people actually want to hear what I think about them. Like, that's pretty cool. And I get to make what I want to make, and sometimes people want to show them in their spaces. And sometimes people want to have conversations about what they thought based on what I made. So that's pretty cool. Difficulty, yeah. I think, to be honest, really, it's just like making sure you can figure out how to support yourself or myself with my work. I'm not the type of person, I'm not a commercial artist. I don't sell my work. So I'm not beholden to have to make a certain type of thing to support myself. I basically have made a pact with my work where I'm like, you show up, I'll take care of us. I will go and I'll make money, and then I will give it to you, and you just have to show up. You don't have to do anything for us. You don't have to make us money, whatever. And right now, maybe it's just the sunshine. It's so nice out. I'm like, oh, there's nothing bad about this. That could be it. But that's the only thing that's coming up right now. And then I guess living on Long Island, it is sometimes a challenge when people don't understand what you do. And I think it just depends on the context of where you are and how people might perceive my profession and what that means for me. And that can be sometimes challenging to like relate on a professional level with other people.
How do they misunderstand?
How do they misunderstand? Well, for instance, if I say, oh yeah, I make sound work with earthworms, they don't see that as art. And by they, I mean like a very, like there's obviously like art space and art context, but I think if I'm thinking more about just like more in general on Long Island, that just doesn't read as me doing anything of value. So there's always this, for me at least, I'm approaching it now and being like, this is something I've been dealing with, where it's like, does this community or does a community need to see what I'm doing as valuable? And that can also be connected back to like earthworm labor, like this invisible labor. I feel like all artists labor in different ways. They're working. That's what they're doing. Is it a resource? Does it produce something? Sometimes not. Is that production, like, do they produce some type of utility that other people can use? No. Is it productive? Depends on who's asking. So that's something that I guess through my work I'm also thinking about, this idea of my labor and what that means, and if what I produce is valuable and how and to whom.
in terms of invisible labor, when you are an artist whose primary identity is artist, but whose income, the way you support yourself, does not always come from your artwork or the sale of your artwork. Maybe it comes from wherever it comes from. In the sphere in which you make the money, your artistic labor is invisible. And then when you are an artist, in that sphere, the art world, that those jobs you have to work to support yourself as an artist, sometimes that's invisible. And in either sphere, the other isn't valued so much. Have you met with that challenge of either from one side, well, you don't make your money doing this, so you're not that. And on the flip side, in the art world, do you deal with, like, oh, you have to have a job or do this or that?
Yeah. Well, luckily for me, I decided early that I was not going to take any work that didn't somehow feed into my practice or wasn't aligned within the art space in some capacity. So for me, it's been adjuncting, it's been working at museums, working at artist studios, and curating. So it's always been within the art space where my work is still all fluid and connected. I think it's, can you repeat the second part of your question? Because it was a good one and I don't want to.
There's two spheres. When you're not in the art world, sometimes, and I've seen different artists receive this, or if they're talking to somebody who's not in the arts, they might hear this from them, that this bias where if you aren't making your primary income from the sale of your work,
then you're not an artist. Oh, yes. That's, yeah. Yeah. I mean, like if someone were to be like, oh yeah, are you like an artist full time? Like what does that...
do this full time.
What does that mean? Like yes, I am an artist. How I support that has no weight on what I do and the value of what I do. But yeah, of course there are people who are like, oh, so you're an artist but you don't sell your work. Oh, so you're like a hobbyist or like something gross like that. Which is fine, like, no, it's not gross to have art as a hobby. But for me, I'm like, this is what I'm doing. And I don't know if I can make this comparison, but I'm going to. It's like, you don't make your money from being a mother, so you're not a mother. Like, no, I make my money from doing this, and then I take care of my children.
Yeah.
That doesn't make that job not as important.
Right.
So I personally think that's a fair comparison as someone who doesn't have children. So someone can come for me, that's fine. But I think there's something to that where like you're doing a thing that's so important, and just because it doesn't provide financial income that makes it less than, like that really, that's a societal problem.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate, but it's something that a lot of artists have to overcome. And I think for me at least, some of my favorite artists and who I think are the most successful do not make money from selling their work. It's from something else that they're doing, which I think makes them way more valuable, because you can burn my sculptures, you can break this, you can do that. None of that matters, because that's not the work. It's something else. And I think that helps me sleep at night.
Thanks, Lauren.
You're welcome, Matt.